I want to wrap up these devotionals on peace with one of the most well-loved and most comforting passages in the Bible. It is from the final chapter of Paul's letter to the Philippians, and it speaks of the peace which passes all understanding. Hello, I'm Stuart Baskin, pastor of First Presbyterian Church of Tyler, Texas, and this is your daily devotional for Saturday, December 10th, 2022. Just a quick reminder of what I'm doing. During this Advent season, I'm focusing on the 4 candles of the Advent wreath that we light each week. Every Sunday, we light one more candle until all 4 candles are lit. Then on Christmas Eve, we light a center candle, the Christ candle, to signify that our time of waiting has come to an end. The 4 Advent candles are the candles of hope, peace, joy, and love. Last week we talked about hope in its several dimensions. This week we've been talking about the nature of peace, the peace that Christ brings into the world. Today I conclude my exploration of peace with a well-loved passage from Philippians. But instead of reading only the single verse, I want to read what comes before it as a way not only of placing it in context, which is always important for understanding, but of understanding the practical importance of peace. Even a cursory scan of Paul's letters, including this letter to the Philippians, reveals that Paul was constantly dealing with threats to the life of the church. Sometimes the threats came in the form of itinerant preachers teaching false doctrine. Sometimes the threat came in the form of hostility to the church from outsiders. But sometimes the threat came from conflicts among members of the church itself. From the context of this particular letter, there was a conflict between 2 women in the church, 2 leaders. What this conflict was about, we simply don't know. Paul just assumes his readers know. It could have been a disagreement about theology and what the church should believe. Or it could have been a petty disagreement about nothing we would consider important. Either way, their disagreement and estrangement Paul evidently regarded as a threat to the church itself. Now, one thing to bear in mind here is that when Paul wrote letters to particular churches, he fully expected that his letters would be read out loud to the whole congregation, probably during a service of worship. Bear that in mind as I read the first part of this passage. Paul says, I urge Euodia and I urge Syntyche to be of the same mind in the Lord. Yes, and I ask you also, my loyal companion, help these women, for they have struggled beside me in the work of the gospel, together with Clement and the rest of my co-workers, whose names are in the book of life. If I were Euodia or Syntyche, I would be mortified to hear my name read out loud in front of the whole congregation. I assumed they were like us. They wouldn't want their dirty laundry aired out in such a public way. What we most often do when we have conflicts in the church is we try our best to solve the conflict quietly behind closed doors so as not to embarrass anyone. The effect is to sweep things under the rug, to paper over differences in order to maintain at least the appearance of unity. But that was not Paul's way of doing things. He was a firm believer in bringing conflict out into the open and dealing with it directly. So, having now thoroughly embarrassed Euodia and Syntyche by naming their conflict before the whole church, he utters words that we often quote completely apart from the context of these women's petty conflict. He says, "Rejoice in the Lord always. Again I will say, rejoice. Let your gentleness be known to everyone. The Lord is near. Do not worry about anything, but in everything, by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus." What Paul does here is to place the conflict between these 2 women, leaders in the Philippian church, into context. And that context is the immediate and imminent return of Christ. Next to that, their conflict should become so insignificant as to enable the two of them to reconcile. Instead of fretting about some minor issue, they should focus on the big picture. Doing so, says Paul, will replace their angst over whatever minor squabble they're having with a sense of peace and calm because of the coming of Christ into the world. Peace, in this context, once again implies the absence of conflict, but also much more. It implies that many of our conflicts are so minor and so petty in comparison with the coming of Christ as to be not worthy of our time, and it implies that the knowledge of Christ's imminent return can be a source of such internal peace as to enable us no longer to fret about our silly differences. Would that the church could hear this anew today. When we return next week, joy. But for now, may God continue to bless you and keep you in all that you do this day and in all the days ahead.